as usual, it's good to see you, looking sharp.
Thank you very much, sir.
You've been traveling recently?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Oh, okay, good.
Mm-hmm.
Good. I think where we left off, last time we had done a fair amount of history and brought things sort of up to date in terms of post-slavery. We didn't really get into contemporary issues, but I want to backtrack, shall we say, and deal with African religion, and perhaps we should even say African spirituality, because maybe we can discuss the difference between spirituality and religion, because religion has so much of a cultural overlay in terms of spirituality. But one of the things that, because I think that religion or spirituality is the basis of culture, and culture is what we do and what has manifested over time in terms of our history. So we've done some history. I think we have to go back to the religion or spirituality, then come back and see how that manifested culture, and then come up to the current period, because I think that's where we need to be in terms of talking about where we are, in terms of talking about reparations, the destruction that has been done, and perhaps even talking about the new paradigm, which from my thinking has to be the African paradigm, because that's our original civilization that understood who we were as people and understood our relationship to our environment. And that's laid out, and certainly, as you know, pyramid texts and so on, going back to 4000 BC or thereabouts. One of the things that I read somewhere in your writings, and by the way, once again, I have to praise you on your scholarship, which is very, very wide. And again, not just in terms of history, but in terms of religion, in terms of science, and so much of what we have done as African people over time. You point out that writing goes back possibly to what, 5000 BC or more in terms of Africa. But when you look at Southern Europe, it only goes back to about 500 BC. So when you look also at Homo sapiens, we go back 200,000 years. So much of what we have experienced really has to come down to us by word of mouth and stories and myths and legends. And that's where we really have to go to try to understand our roots. And one of the people that we need to, in terms of looking at those roots, how did we come up with our concepts of religion, if you will, and again, maybe you want to define also spirituality versus religion. Maybe that's my fetish, if you will. But religion becomes cultural in terms of how spirituality sees itself. It depends on the trees that are out there, or the animals that are out there, or the weather that's out there, or your neighbors that's out there. And because religion ends up as shall we say, ritual, as well as dogma, and that really is the things. Whereas spirituality is not so much things, but is a spiritual essence, which is a consciousness, which influences behavior, and you have to look for it in the essence of culture. But the reverse can happen, meaning that religion can hide spirituality if it's not interpreted properly. I'm saying all of that to say that I think we are confused generally in terms of talking about spirituality and talking about religion. But beside that, let's go back to how do you think religious ideas came about during that period of time when we didn't have writing, et cetera, et cetera?
Thanks for the question, sir. Looking at the scholarship that I've seen, two scholars have had something relevant to say that I think is worth repeating. There was an English scholar from the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century called Gerald Massey. And he wrote a number of books, but the most important is a 2-volume book called Ancient Egypt, the Light of the World. An African-American scholar who's actually a medical doctor by day, but is a very, very great scholar, Professor Charles S. Finch. And he has developed the model. And Finch's ideas are the ideas that I teach. So I'm getting it partly from Massey and wholly from Finch. So how did religious ideas come about? Well, Gerald Massey raised the question, did man create God in his own image? And answered, no. If you look at the earliest images that we have of humans conceptualizing this massive power, it wasn't anthropomorphic. It wasn't thinking of God as one big giant human or a series of humans. Originally, they used images from the natural world. And those images could be animals, it could be the elemental forces of day and night. So a number of different things. Now, what happened was Dr. Finch then worked on it. And he argues that more or less, if we're using mythology as our guide, he believes that you can trace our religious ideas and how early humans, African humans, produced these ideas. Essentially, the very first stage was to conceive of the divine power or powers as female superhuman types taken from nature. And among these types would be the pregnant hippopotamus, representing Great Mother Earth, and the idea of a hippo being large and impressive, representing Earth and sustaining life. And why pregnant? Because about to give birth. Now, it doesn't mean that early Africans worshipped hippos. What it shows is the idea that why that symbol would be used is that it's a powerful symbol. Later images would come from things like trees. The branches representing protection, and the food representing sustenance. And the idea of a tree and what it represents. Again, it doesn't mean that early Africans worship trees. It means they are used as powerful symbols. And then you've got certain deities that were then associated with the tree. You've got the ancient Sudanese and ancient Egyptian goddess, Hathor, who is associated with the sycamore tree. And what's really interesting is that the sycamore tree didn't even originate in Egypt. It originated in Central Africa and was brought to Egypt, and showing that the ancestors of the ancient Egyptians used to live in Central Africa before they replanted the sycamore tree and moved it further and further north into Egypt. Then you've got, for example, the Igbo goddess Idemili, who's associated with the Ogilizi tree. Then you've got the second stage, according to Finch, where humans use the elemental powers of day and night, sun and moon, as images to represent the divine. And you would have the moon being associated with women, because a female menstrual cycle is approximately the same length as a lunar cycle. So you've got the goddess Hathor associated with the moon. Later deities like Aset, some people use the more Greek version of the name Isis, being associated with the moon. And by the way, Hathor, the African deity of Sudan and Egypt, by the time the Greeks came on the scene, they changed her name to Aphrodite. It's the same deity, right? All right, then you've got the next development where humans started to conceive of God as a human. And this is where we start getting deified women. And these deified women would be women that contributed greatly to society and were then deified under certain names. So, for example, the goddess Neith is the goddess of weaving and warfare using bow and arrow. And so we can therefore presume that in the dim and distant past, some woman in early Africa got deified under that name, Neith. And then at a much later date, she then becomes Athena. So the next stage after that, then after deified women, is then this whole idea of totemism and taboo. And the idea of totemism is an early idea that Africans had, that your clanic identity is based on which animal or plant totem mythology says you descended from. You know, like today we have surnames. Yours is Garvey, mine is Walker. Before that concept existed, it would be your clanic identity taken from a plant or animal totem. And eventually a mythology starts to develop around that animal, around that plant, and the mythology then says, you can't consume that because that's sacred to your community. But it doesn't mean that a rival community cannot consume that, and therefore you trade what you have with them, and they trade with what they have with you. And this is then economics. And then on the back of economics, we then get the birth of civilization. And the very first civilization was in ancient Nubia, called the Kingdom of Tarseti. And this is now the very first country on the planet Earth that has now moved to civilization. A few hundred years later, we get the second country moving to civilization, the civilization of Kemet, ancient Egypt. 1,000 or so years after that, we then get the third civilization, which is Sumer. On a modern map is where Iraq is today. And despite being in the Middle East, that used to be a black civilization. Then we get the fourth civilization, Elam, which is where Iran is today. But what all these civilizations have in common is that they have male and female deities. And it represents the idea of divine balance, if you like, between male and female power. And then the next development after that then is where we get the first civilization to write down their religious ideas. And the oldest written account that we have is the pyramid texts. And the pyramid texts are inside the pyramid of Pharaoh Unas, who was an Egyptian pharaoh of the 5th ruling dynasty. And that is the beginnings of scripture.
Well, you know, that's a fabulous tour through thousands and thousands of years in terms of history, and perhaps we should say also philosophy in terms of understanding of ourselves. And I think it's based on, shall we say, the first human beings really looking at self and looking at surroundings, which is nature, and learning from nature. You know, what does water do? Water quenches your thirst, or you wash yourself with water. What do trees do? They bear fruit, or they give you shade, or you can use a branch to make a house, or what have you. So there's a relationship with everything that's around you. I mean, what does the rock do? It's firm, you can sit on it, or you can shape it, or whatever. Or certain rocks have certain colors, which we nowadays we could call gold or silver or turquoise or whatever it is, but they're pretty colors, and you can use them for ornaments. But there's this understanding, I think, behind all of it, that it's one creation, and there's this manifestation by the one creation, or the creator, if you will, of all of this multiplicity of entities which function in certain ways. And then I think, especially when we come down to the hieroglyphics, we can see that the hieroglyphics are symbolic of animals or plants or trees or what have you, that have certain functional properties. Like
Can I just jump in there,
the lion might represent the functional property of courage or bravery. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, let me just throw in one thing. I know it sounds obvious, but it's not. You know, ancient Egyptian writings, It's only when they're carved that they're called hieroglyphics.
Mm.
If they're written, it's not hieroglyphics, only when it's carved. And why? Because hieroglyphics means sacred carvings. Do you see? Right. So when you
thought it was just sacred
hieroglyphics,
writings. I didn't know it was sacred carvings.
sacred carvings. So if you write it, it's not called hieroglyphics. It's called hieratic.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So if it's written, if you take out a pen and you write that stuff, it's not, they're not carvings, they're writings.
Mm-hmm.
So that becomes hieratic.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea then was the fact that it's carved gives it, the ancient Egyptian term for it is medunecha. So you've got this idea of it being God's word. And this idea of it being carved gives it a permanence because it's now outside of time, because it's going to be around forever. And so just by calling it hieroglyphics, so hieroglyphics is what the Europeans called it, the Greeks called it that, but they got the concept right. It's sacred carvings, not sacred writings.
That's interesting. I think that also probably shows a certain evolution in terms of thinking, that their philosophy had reached a stage where they understood that their own thinking and understanding of the universe and themselves had reached a consistency of understanding that transcended time and space, as you say, and therefore it could be carved into a stone that may represent eternity.
Yeah.
Like when what's his name found the Memphite theology, carved in the Shabaka stone.
Yeah.
That was also, I think, an example, of that. But I think what's important is the symbolism that all of this early understanding of nature represented when there was an attempt to communicate either with each other or for posterity in terms of any type of writing. And that clearly comes down to Kemet or the civilization that preceded Kemet, as you mentioned. In that you see a representative of let's say the soul of man as a bow bird, a bird, or you see Tat or Tehuti with an animal head of the ibis.
Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret. Keen to popularize Pan-African heritage, we have 2 products that should interest you. We are giving away an introductory free book called 100 Black History Facts. Secondly, our online course, The Black Secret, has 55 hours of filmed content. You will systematically learn every major theme in our history, going all the way back.
And what the ibis then represents in terms of a function in nature, the precision with which the ibis would pick food out of the water, etc. Or you see Anubis representing, a canine representing the digestive process, and you can see, somebody with a head of Anubis, or you see Anubis as an animal, and you see then representing the transformation, because the digestive process is a transformation of food going into the body and then becoming nourishment, etc. So the symbolism is a symbolism that shows you an understanding of the function of the symbol. And I think, this is very, very critical in terms of the early stages of our human understanding. But when it comes all the way down to writing and alphabetical writing, that becomes completely lost. And the alphabet, from A to Z, it's pretty much meaningless in terms of A, B, C. And then you put it together and create words, and then the words themselves have to be defined. There's no natural connection to functions in the universe or in you as a person. So somebody gives them a definition, and then you have to look up that definition in the dictionary, or it's taught to you in schools and so on and so forth. So you get into a whole world of intellect. And of course, we're going to get there later on, but I think that's how the European developed in terms of their own intelligence. They came to it through an alphabet and a language that was describing things that had been experienced for thousands of years before by Africans and the other civilizations that you mentioned, such as Elam, and Sumer.
Yeah.
And of course, then Mohenjo-Daro and other places there in the Middle East, going on to India.
Yeah.
And one of the things that comes out of this, I think, this lack of understanding, and maybe we can go into some of these ways in which Europe and Europeans who have come very late to an understanding of life have looked at Africa, looked at Kemet, and have called, so much of what we do, quotes, paganism. What does paganism mean? Or have looked at it and called it fetishism. What does fetishism mean? These, again, we get back to these definitions, shall we say, of Europeans. And you get to
jump in there, sir.
I'm throwing in animism. Go ahead with those three, if you will, in terms of how you would define them and what they mean.
Again, what it is because we now live in such an anti-Black world, we forget certain things. Let me give you an example. When the ancient Greek historian Herodotus visits Egypt, he recognized, wait a minute, the Greek gods are nothing more than Egyptian gods under different names. So he recognized that the Greek Zeus is really the ancient Egyptian Amen. And he was able to map off a lot of them. And since then, we now know which ones they are. So we now know that Neith is really Athena. We know that Aphrodite is really Hathor. We know that Ceres is really Isis. And we can then map them all off. Now, when you had, just before the slave trade really kicked off, you had the Portuguese sailing around Africa. And they landed in Benin. And when they landed in Benin, they left Portuguese people at the Benin Empire's court. And then they took 4 Benin people and took them back to Portugal to find out more about the Empire of Benin. And the people of Benin decided, okay, because our priest is going to travel across the water, we are going to send the priest of Olokun across the water to Benin. And in European accounts of the same story, they don't say the priest of Olokun, they say the priest of Neptune. So what does that, now that automatically tells me that they know that Olokun is Neptune, is Poseidon. So the idea then that African religions are backward, primitive, whatever. If you read the European accounts, they don't say that. They knew that Olokun, oh, that's Neptune, that's Poseidon. Do you see? Nowadays, scholars will play dumb. Whereas when you read the accounts back in the day, they don't play dumb. They translate Olokun as Neptune. So what it is then is, unfortunately, we live in a world of Judeo-Christian Islamic bigotry. And these bigoted ideas, if you don't believe these religions, then you're a pagan, you're a heathen. Even the word ethnic originally meant pertaining to the heathen. It didn't mean belonging to an ethnic group. It meant pertaining to the heathen. So it's a racist word. And then you can see how the Arabic word for pagan, kafir, has become the strongest term of insult that you can throw at a Black Southern African. It's a racist term. So what happened is that a lot of these bigoted ideas coming out of the Judeo-Christian Islamic position, unfortunately, the terms that these bigots used have become a part of the vocabulary, and they should never have become a part of the vocabulary. Because, of course, the Judeo-Christian Islamic thing also comes out of the traditions that Africans put down back in the day.
Well, I think we discussed that, the whole ancient history, shall we say, was rewritten in terms of 17th century and 18th century Europe in terms of their universities. And I think Bernal is one that pointed this out, that as you're mentioning, previous historians, such as Herodotus and so on, understood the priority, shall we say, of African civilization.
Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret. Keen to popularize Pan-African heritage, we have 2 products that should interest you. We are giving away an introductory free book called 100 Black History Facts. Secondly, our online course, The Black Secret, has 55 hours of filmed content. You will systematically learn every major theme in our history, going all the way back.
And marveled at the extent of African civilization. And that is recorded, over time. And we know of how many of the Greeks, including Aristotle, Pythagoras, Plato, and Socrates, went and studied in Kemet, because they were the ignoramuses and the universities, and the civilization was in Kemet. But as you say, so much of it has come down in terms of this negative, aspect, so that contemporary, both Europeans as well as Africans and the rest of the world, as a matter of fact, look at Africans and African religion, as this, anomaly, and this shall we say, a primitive way of looking at life, ancestral worship, as if to say that this now is some, horrible thing. How can you worship your ancestors? And then we go to the whole concept again of polytheism, and then the belief that somehow the Judeo-Christian Islamic world created monotheism, which are misnomers in the first place. When you look at all African religions, there's always one God, shall we say, who is, and they're lesser gods who are functional entities, just like there were, way back in the day of Kemet, where Ra was the primary deity, shall we say, with this trinity of qualities. Amun meaning consciousness, Ra meaning is power, and of course Ptah meaning is creative ability and totipotentiality. And then you come down to, again, like the Yoruba, where there's Olodumare, who is the god, and then there are all these lesser gods that carry out the functions of Olodumare. And you can find the same thing, I think, in the Akan, it's Nyame, and as you go through the different traditional African religions, you find there's always this overarching one supreme deity that creates life, if you will. And both the trees and the plants, the animals and the rocks and people are manifestations of this deity. And within each of us is some aspect of this overarching God. So that there's a deity resident in the rock, as well as in the tree, as well as in the water, etc., etc. And of course, now you come to E equals MC squared. And that's what animism meant, back in the day. And Einstein discovered that in the late 19th century or something like that, that matter is based on energy. Well, we know that a long time ago. And now they're finding that energy doesn't exist by itself, but in terms of quantum physics, they're finding that consciousness is what moves everything. And when consciousness enters into any sort of experiment in terms of what they're doing, it changes the nature of the experiment, and it changes the result that you might get out of it. So now post-quantum, we're coming to consciousness. And we have understood that, more than 6,000 years ago. I think it's all remarkable, but we need to reconstruct, what has been destroyed and divided, and what has been denigrated over time in terms of our spirituality, our religion. Because I think the thing that is critical is that our spirituality or religion was always a way of life. It's not something that was done on Saturday, like the Seventh-day Adventists, or something that was done on Sunday, like most, of these other religions, the so-called monotheistic religions. There's a specific day for them, where they do a particular ritual, and et cetera, et cetera. But for the African person, for the longest time, thousands and thousands of years, religion was a way of life. And as you know, in many of the languages, there's no such word for religion. It's simply the way that you understand yourself and your relationship to the cosmos, to God, if you will, and the things that you do on a daily basis, where there's so-called ancestor worship, which means simply respect, for your ancestors and your lineage in terms of what they've handed down to you, and they've gone on to the other side, the spirit world. So they're not dead. We always believe in the spiritual side, which is life and always continues. There's birth and there's death, but life is continuous. And we have to get back, to that. And I think it's important for us to elucidate the fact that there's been so much negative propaganda, relative to something that's original in terms of humanity. These are humanity's first understandings of what it means to be human, and what it means to really look at nature and understand nature and understand your relationship to it. And this goes
Can I jump in there, sir?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
My tutor, the very great Femi Biko, he used to teach that traditional African religions internally police the mind. And this is a more effective way of building social order than the state externally policing the body. In other words, you're about to steal that apple, and then you ask yourself, is the divine forces looking at me, yes or no? Then you don't steal that apple. That is a better way of building social order. And when it comes to the way that traditional African religions police the mind, that is a plus that no one is talking about. That is a quality that no one's talking about. Similarly, when we go back to the Nile Valley and we look at chapter 125 in the Book of the Dead, it doesn't say, thou shalt not kill. It says, I have not killed. And this idea that you taking responsibility for doing the right thing, not because you've been commanded to do the right thing, is because you've taken responsibility for doing the right thing. Again, is a very, very high level of ethics, which again, no one really talks about enough when we deal with traditional African religion. And thirdly, the intellectual heritage of traditional African religions. A heritage that a lot of us didn't know until books like The Pale Fox came out, and then people found out that the Dogon have a concept that's just like Big Bang. The Dogon have a concept that's just like string theory. The Dogon have a concept that's just like parallel and multiple universes. And then you then find out that these are intellectual assets that need to be bigged up with the same seriousness that we big up any other intellectual tradition. And so we've got the practical use of African religion to build social order. You've got the fact being that it encourages you to take responsibility for doing the right thing. And the third thing is African traditional ideas show a very, very high IQ type of culture that no one is really giving it the credit for.
Mm-hmm. You're 100% right in terms of that, or 1,000% right. If you look at the European systems, there is no ideal in terms of what the human should be in terms of his functioning in society. If anything, the ideal is somebody who gets on the cover of Time magazine or Forbes, and owns is valued at several $billion, or nowadays probably in the trillions of dollars. That's the man of the year, type of person that we see. Or I guess nowadays it could be the woman of the year. But how they got to that level of wealth, is usually sort of hidden. And this degree of acquisition is what is considered, to be most valuable within a society that is fundamentally, of course, materialistic. And that's the point, is that African religion or African way of life has always been a way of life that balanced spirituality and materialism, plus the fact, understanding that matter didn't start with matter, but it started on the spiritual side, because matter can't create itself. So it has to be created by something. We go back to Einstein, he said it was energy, but we go back before the Big Bang. And we know that it was our story there at Hermopolis, which I know you know very well, meaning that the primeval no or none, if you want to call it, where there was the formlessness, no and no-net, and where there was the darkness, Kirk and Kirket, out of which came light and out of which came form. There was He and He-et, which is infinity and eternity, out of which came space and time. And then there was Amun and Amunet, which is consciousness, out of which came consciousness of things. So we know what happened before the Big Bang. This is our definition of the whole, the creation story, the beginning of our cosmology, which shows that spirit, it came before matter. Matter didn't come till Atum Ra created the island, with light and so on. And then the rest of creation, the island itself simply representing matter. And then Ptah, the intelligence or the intellect of, Amun and Ra, then, did the rest of creation. In terms of, Shu and Tefnut and Nut and Geb, et cetera. So all of these things are there. I mean, and this goes back, as you know, probably before 6,000 years, because these were stories that came down. I think we can go back, as I recall, I think it's in Schwaller de Lubis, writes about the king lists that were present. I can't think of the source, but one of the sources was Manetho, but there was a particular papyrus anyway that goes back with the king list, and then before that the list of the different quotes divinities. And you can trace everything back. If you look at the king list, it goes back about 36,000 years or 40,000 years. So this is something not just 6,000 years ago, but by word of mouth. Before the writing, it came down from 40,000 years before, which is absolutely amazing. But this is ignored, as if things started in Greece and Rome. And we have to recapture this because it's so valuable and it's so important. And of course, certain things are being, quote, discovered now and being attributed to these genius Europeans, when it was known You know, certainly 6,000 years ago, if not 40,000 years ago.
Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret. Keen to popularize Pan-African heritage, we have two products that should interest you. We are giving away an introductory free book called 100 Black History Facts. Secondly, our online course, The Black Secret, has 55 hours of filmed content. You will systematically learn every major theme in our history, going all the way back.
Yeah, absolutely right. And this is one of the reasons why we've got to get on top of our history. And then based on the history, all the things that come out of it, our religion, spirituality, philosophy, and all the things that come out of that too, art, music, literature, architecture, and so on. Because this is how we reclaim our culture. And this is how we build pride in our ancestry and heritage. And that way we don't feel inferior to anybody, especially once we can get this knowledge out to as many of the people as we need to get it out to.
You know, again, you know, you're doing, you know, a fabulous job, and you know, we need to keep doing, you know, more of these things to popularize this understanding, you know, and we go back and we stand on the shoulders of people like, you know, Dr. Ben, Charles Finch, and so many others who have looked at these areas and given us so much information, going back to John Jackson and all of these scholars over the years who, you know, have been poo-pooed and so on, and the results of their scholarship, you know, have been denied. You know, just as Bernal's was denied when he talked about the old model of history and the rewrite. And for example, again, there's a lot of information. You mentioned the Dogon in terms of West African post-traditional religion, that the Yorubas traced themselves as migrating across the continent and ending up in, I think it's Ile-Ife, and in a sense starting their kingdom there. But their knowledge base is very similar to the Egyptian knowledge base, and you know, many of their deities and so on mirror the same understanding of nature, whether it's coincidental, meaning, you know, another group of people think of the same thing, or it's one tradition with the movement of people across Africa.
Can I jump in there, sir?
Yeah, please do. Yes.
There is a Nigerian philosopher in this country called Chukwunyiri Kamalu. I don't know if that name means anything. Does it mean anything?
I have one of his books, I'm sure, yes.
And what he has come with is extremely powerful, because he did a book called Person, Divinity, and Nature. Right. And in that book, what he shows is that what makes up a human being, the different elements of what makes up a human being. For example, ancient Egyptians, you've got concepts like Ka, Ba, Ab, Ren, Kat, Kaibit, Sa, Ku, whatever. And these are all different aspects that make up a human being. Now, his point is that if you look through traditional African religions, the concept of a destiny or spiritual double is there. The idea of the soul or breath is there. The idea of the heart is there. The idea of the ancestral guardian is there. And the idea of the shadow is there. Okay, so what? Here's the so what. When these different entities that make up a human being are organized, they form a singular entity known as the person. But when this unity breaks down, we no longer have a balanced and centered person. What we have is mental illness. And so by coming with these idea of the multiple selves, these traditional African religions therefore have a theoretical model of what we can call mental health and mental ill health. And Consequently, the idea that spiritual practices can, in certain situations, be used to treat mental ill health, that's a big concept. And so, again, when it comes to how we see what our ancestors came up with, it's very important. Femi Biko taught me this years ago. It's very important that we don't primitivize it, because this is sophisticated stuff here. You see, what it is, you know, you've got Greek concepts such as the id, the ego, and so on, so on and so forth. I'm not knocking those concepts. That's what the Greeks came up with. Cool. But the main point is we had our own, and ultimately our own concepts predate theirs. And these concepts, as I said, give us a conceptual definition of mental health, and therefore mental ill health, and therefore a scientific concept of why spirituality can actually become a part of a health regimen, you see, and it's not hocus pocus anymore.
You know, I'm very interested in Kemet and its philosophy and spirituality, because it has everything. And what a lot of people, I don't think, understand is that it has a psychology as well as the spirituality, because the flip side of the psychology is the spirituality. And I'll just run that down a little bit. The oldest story known to man is the story of Ausar, because that was even before the pyramid texts and so on, and because that was an oral tradition that came down. Now you talked about the entity, the person. And we can look at the story of Ausar, Auset, Seth, Nephthys, and Heru as a family, and that's the family that is quotes mind, which we call mind, but there's big mind and there's little mind, and I'll discuss that in a second. And now Ausar is in a sense the total personality, along with Auset, but these have functionalities. Now, the normal functionality would be of Ausar and Auset as a unit, and that really represents unconditioned consciousness. And that is what big mind is. Mind is really consciousness functioning, you know, through intellect and through the physical body on the physical plane. But mind then becomes, or consciousness becomes conditioned. It becomes conditioned by your social circumstances, et cetera, or your own behavior patterns over time. Now that's where, you know, Seth and Nephthys come in, because Seth represents ego, and Nephthys represents the perceptive apparatus that sees the five senses. The five senses report to Nephthys, and Nephthys is perception, and she carries that information to Seth, who is the ego, and decides on how Nephthys should behave, meaning she conceptualizes, she pays attention to this, that, and the other thing. And Seth is the one that says, I like this, or I don't like that, or I don't care about that. So Seth's responses are like, which ends up with desire, etc., or dislike, which ends up with animosity or anger, or ignoring, I don't care about that, which ends up with ignorance and confusion. So you can see, you know, Seth is the disordered personality when Seth is ruling this family, as opposed to Ausar and Auset, which are unconditioned consciousness. Okay, so that's the basis of the psychology. You have all of these entities. Now, what happens? Seth kills Ausar, and what that means, and look at how he kills him. He puts him in a sarcophagus, and then he throws him in the river. So that means your original self, your original understanding of who you are, is suppressed and suffocated. Okay, and then later on now, after Auset, you know, and this is the story by Plutarch, etc., mostly by Plutarch, but again, it's based on Manetho and other historical context. When Auset finds the body, brings it back to Egypt, Seth at night, in the moonlight, and again, this goes back to your idea of the moon and understanding that the period of the moon, the 28 period, is important because what happens, Seth opens the casket, takes out the body of Ausar, cuts it into 14 pieces. So that's the waning moon, and distributes it all over Egypt. But then, of course, Auset and Nephthys then go and search for all these different parts, put them back together. So that's the waxing moon. And once they put it back together, you can see what is the moon. The moon is the reflection of the sun, of the light of the sun, and that Ra is God. So God, that's the sunlight, and the moon is the reflection of the sunlight. That's another way of saying that man, Ausar, who is our eponymous ancestor, is made in the image of God, and that's using that particular symbolism. So here you have Ausar reconstituted and has an asexual relationship with Auset, as well as one with Nephthys. And Nephthys now becomes Hathor, or Heru, the house of Heru. So it's so interesting. I mean, we can I'm just losing you here to look at. Yeah, here we are. It's so interesting. So now with the birth of Heru, Auset raises Heru. No, Heru. You know, Heru then, Auset represents pure consciousness, as she was with Ausar. Ausar and Auset are a pair, or a couple. And again, you know, you get into Western ideas of sister, wife, consort, but it's simply the female and male polarities. That's all that means. It really doesn't have anything to do with sexuality per se. You know, we're not going to get into all the gender stuff. But in any event, Heru, or Horus, is her offspring. Now, what that means, and she raises Heru in terms of his strength when he grows up to be a strong young man, and she teaches him. Now, this is that whole business of awareness, because that's exactly who Auset is, the ability to be aware of things or to be conscious of things, as opposed to Ausar, who is the internal consciousness, the primary consciousness. She is the consciousness of things in the three-dimensional world. So Heru now is raised to be able to concentrate and be this awareness. Now, when he's at a certain age, then he's able to fight Seth to regain the throne, because Seth has been ruling, and of course Seth is disordered and he's causing all kinds of confusion and chaos and individualism and war, etc., and poverty, which was not there in the golden age when Ausar was running things, as you know, in the early part of the story. So Heru then fights Seth. And what that means is that Heru is now focused attention and willpower. Just as Atum Ra was the will of God Ra, Heru is now the willpower of Ausar, if you will. And he ends up defeating Seth, of course, with the tribunal of gods watching. So it's a cosmic event, you know. And what that means is that this is a story of every man. It's not just a story of one king per se, but it's the story of every man under creation. And he is, you know, gaining the consent through Thoth as an intermediary, and of course Thoth is wisdom, the god of wisdom, and he pleads with the tribunal, and finally they agree, although Ra didn't want to initially. And Ra didn't want to initially because Ra by itself means brute force, and that's what Seth represented, brute force. But the other deities convinced him. So now Heru then defeats Seth and is given the throne. What does he do? He goes to the inner world, the duat, which people call the underworld. I call it the inner world. And now he resurrects Ausar, meaning that you're resurrecting your soul. And now what he's doing is resurrecting his soul. Okay, when the duat, he lifts up Ausar, and then he opens his mouth with the ads, and you know that part of the story. What that means now is that Ausar is able to speak. Ausar is energized; he's allowed to speak. And who does he speak through? He speaks through his son. He speaks through his son Horus, who is now on the throne. And as you know, Auset or Isis, her hieroglyph is a female entity with a throne on her head. So what that means now is that he has this continuous awareness, and that's another reason that's symbolized by the Jed column, which is like the backbone, which is a symbol of continuous consciousness, which in the Buddhist tradition we consider samadhi, or the Vajra-like samadhi, meaning the undisturbed consciousness that is unconditioned, undistracted, etc. So this is that whole, psychic event where, you are confused. Set is in charge. You have this egotistical person who is doing all these things, and then you're able to concentrate your awareness and then unravel, shall we say, Seth and the different conditions of your mind in terms of anger and desire and so on and so forth, and you can look at your mind and see all of the wrong things that you have done, and therefore transform yourself. So it's the first psychology, and you can see it in Buddhism, and you can see it, also in Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism. They all have a similar things. For example, Ausar would be the Atma in terms of Vedanta. And for example, Nephthys would be considered Manas, and the ego would be considered Ahamkara, and Auset would be considered Buddhi. Anyway, I'm not going to go into it, but it's there, just as you're saying. It just has to be elucidated, because a lot of people don't know this. They believe that stuff started with Freud, and psychology started with Freud, and then with Jung, and then all of these, newfangled theories. But there is no psychology. It's there in Kemet.
Well said, sir.
And as I said, the flip side of that is the theology, which was taught in the temples, because you know that the birth of the scenes in the temple in Luxor, where was it? Amenope, the birth scenes.
The Luxor Nativity.
Say that again?
The Luxor Nativity.
Yes, exactly right. That's all there, and that's similar to the birth of a divine child. So again, as you know, that's part of Christianity and the so-called monotheistic religions and so on and so forth. But we'll get into that down the road in terms of what they have copied from Kemet in terms of the basis of their religions, in terms of Judaism and Christianity, because again, Islam is sort of a modification of Christianity, if you will, and Judaism.
Yep, I think we can get into that.
All right. All right, shall we call it a wrap today?
Absolutely. Okay, so we know what we're going to talk about next time round. I'm looking forward to it, sir.
Likewise. Thanks, Robin.